It is Independence Day, July 4th, 1863, in south central Pennsylvania. The heat of the last 3 days has finally cooled. The hot summer days of July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd were not only miserable due to the humidity and the scorching hot sun, but because of the bloodiest battle fought on North American soil, the Battle of Gettysburg. The heat of battle by July 3rd had left nearly 45,000 Americans killed, wounded, or captured in and around the little Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg, leaving both the Union Army and Confederate Army depleted of men and resources. After the failure of what became known as Pickett's Charge on July 3rd, Confederate Commander General Robert E. Lee had to weigh his options. With a loss of 32.5% of his men either killed, wounded, or captured, a large contingent of Union prisoners, and a supply line that stretched into Union territory and was at threat of being cut off, Lee called together his generals to discuss their options. To add to the issues, it was now raining. At least the temperature was cooling. It was agreed under the circumstances that Lee's campaign to take the war to the north had failed, and it was time to return to Virginia by crossing back over the mighty Potomac River. As Confederate soldiers laid in wait, prepared for a Union counterstrike, Lee and the leaders of the Confederacy's Army of Northern Virginia planned their strategic withdrawal. The wagon train full of critically wounded would retreat over South Mountain via Black's Gap by way of the Chambersburg Road. Under the protection of cavalry, the train of the wailing and dying wounded would weave south through Franklin County, cross the Mason-Dixon line via the Williamsport Pike, and cross the Potomac at Williamsport, Maryland. The wagon train carrying many of the supplies would head south through Fairfield, Pennsylvania, under protection of cavalry, ascend South Mountain near Blue Ridge Summit, slip past Waynesboro into Leitersburg, Maryland, cross through Hagerstown, Maryland, and rendezvous with the wounded in Williamsport, Maryland. The main army would retreat last, covering the supplies and wounded and their own tails. They would travel through Fairfield, ascend South Mountain at the Monterey Pass, and follow a similar path to the wagon train from there. As the rain fell and the lightning flashed, the guns of both armies were mostly quiet. In the morning of July 4th, Independence Day for the boys in blue, just a few hundred yards away occupying Cemetery Hill, the wagon train of supplies slipped down the Fairfield Road, heading for South Mountain. Union spotters confirmed the movement to General George Meade, commander of the Union's Army of the Potomac, in which Meade ordered General Judson Kilpatrick's cavalry unit to find, intercept, and harass the Confederate wagon train. As the weather threatened thunder, lightning, and torrents of rain, the forces of the Confederate and Union armies were on yet another collision course to battle. But instead of a large engagement in the open fields of Pennsylvania in the clearness of hot summer days like the Battle of Gettysburg, this one would be small. It would occur in a downpour of a lightning storm among the clouds on the top of a mountain, and in the pitch black of a dark and stormy night. Put your slickers on, because it's going to get muddy along the mountain road of Monterey Pass. Before we get into the engagement here at Monterey Pass, let's first get a lay of the land. We are on top of South Mountain, or the Blue Ridge. Carving its way over this top of the mountain was a turnpike, or a toll road, that connected Waynesboro, Pennsylvania with Emmitsburg, Maryland. This road still exists, but it has now been bypassed by modern Route 16, which follows a similar path over the mountain. On a plateaued area on top of the mountain is now home to the town called Blue Ridge Summit, set a hotel called the Monterey Inn. Now in 1863, the Monterey Inn was owned and operated by Charles H. Berman, a local farmer and businessman. Though the Monterey Inn is no longer standing, it stood in the vicinity of the home that's right behind me here, that sits at the corner of Charmian Road and Monterey Lane. And it's just right across the street from the modern day golf course. On the west side of the plateau was the descent to Waynesboro, in which the toll road passes by many steep drop-offs and then weaves its way into the town of Rouserville below. On the east side of the plateau was a steep mountain pass covered in woods, in which the rough road switchbacked its way up the Rocky Mountain slope from the direction of Emmitsburg, Maryland. This rugged mountain incline was known as the Monterey Pass. There were 3 ways to reach this plateau from Fairfield. The road to the east of Jack's Mountain, which would have been the easiest to navigate, but the way that provided the least cover to the retreating Confederates. The road through Greenstone, which connected with the toll road just below Monterey Pass. And lastly, Maria Furnace Road through Fairfield Pass that went deeper into the mountains, passed by Devil's Creek, and connected with the toll road to the west of the Monterey Inn, just near the toll house. And this, behind me here, is the Maria Furnace Road. Because of the cover that it provided, the majority of the retreating Confederates and their wagon train full of supplies took this road, the most deep in the mountains, and navigated through the Fairfield Pass via the Maria Furnace Road. Late in the evening of July 4th, 1863, the owner of the Monterey Inn, Charles H. Berman, came to realize that just down the road from his establishment, near the toll house, emerging from the road coming from Fairfield Pass, was a long wagon train. Realizing that these were Confederates retreating from the horrible fighting they experienced just days before, Berman mounted a horse and hunted down a Union cavalryman that he was acquainted with. Upon hearing of the wagon train from Berman, the cavalryman presented Berman to General Custer, a young cavalry general for the Union that was part of Kilpatrick's unit, to track down the wagon train. This young General Custer is the same General Custer that you read about in your school textbooks, that suffered a military loss and died at the hands of Native American forces at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. General Custer presented Berman to General Judson Kilpatrick on the way from Emmitsburg, who requested Berman to be their guide in the misty, fog-covered mountains, as Berman was well acquainted with the topography here on top of Blue Ridge. Traveling from Emmitsburg, General Kilpatrick's forces hightailed it down the Waynesboro toll road to directly assault the tail end of the wagon train passing by Charles Berman's hotel at Monterey. But first, Kilpatrick had to ascend the mountain, which he chose to travel up the Monterey Pass. Protecting the Confederate wagon train was Confederate cavalry, led by General William Grumble Jones, with assistance from scouts and couriers from 2 Confederate batteries. As the wagon trail moved from the Maria Furnace Road and onto the toll road, which is just over that way, Captain William Tanner realized that the eastern portion of Monterey Pass was unguarded. He deployed a Napoleon cannon to be used to guard the pass in hopes of preventing Union cavalry from advancing on the vulnerable wagon train traveling down this road. The cannon was placed in the pass near where the entrance to the Greenstone Quarry facility is today, and it pointed east and down the mountain at the Waynesboro Road coming from Emmitsburg. This cannon was only supplied with 5 rounds of ammunition, as the rest of the battery continued its route west towards the Potomac River. Along with the cannon was a small squad of men from the Confederates' 1st Maryland Cavalry Battalion, commanded by Captain George M. Emack, that maintained a picket along the pass. Emack's squad was about 20 men strong. That's it. With this protection in place, the cavalry escort pushed the wagon train along to quickly move from its vulnerable position here along the road and at the summit and try to get it down the mountain as fast as it can. With the rain from the previous evening creating mud that bogged down wagon wheel, horse hoof, and soldier boots, the wagon train was slowed considerably here as teamsters worked together to move the supplies and wounded as fast as they could, knowing full well that Union cavalry was going to come creeping around. At dusk, the Union force of General Kilpatrick's cavalry outfit arrived at the base of the mountain with Charles Berman as a guide. At the gate of his farm located near the base of the mountain, the local farmer expressed his want to be relieved of his guide duties. General Kilpatrick was able to convince him to stay on, so Mr. Berman would see the fun. General Custer's brigade of Michiganders was faced with Kilpatrick's fun in the form of a steep climb up the mountain as darkness hemmed in around them and the sky opened to release heavy rain and thunder and lightning once again. As the cavalry began to ascend the mountain pass, the miserable weather, the mountain fog, and the darkness of night closed off of their vision. Edward A. Paul, a New York Times correspondent, wrote of this march up Monterey Pass. Imagine a long column of cavalry winding its way up the mountainside on a road dug out of the mountainside, which sloped at an angle of 30 degrees, just wide enough for 4 horses to march abreast. On one side, a deep abyss, and on the other, an impassable barrier in the shape of a steep embankment. The hour 10 o'clock at night, a drizzling rain falling, the sky overcast, and so dark as literally not to be able to see one's own hand if placed within a foot of the organs of vision. The whole command, both men and animals, worn out with fatigue and loss of sleep. Suddenly, a flash of light and the sound of thunder was heard, surprising the Union cavalrymen. But this was not nature's lightning, it was man-made. Captain Tanner's cannon was firing at the Union cavalry. The confused Michiganders sought cover down the mountain as they broke and retreated at the blast. Captain Emack's small 20-man squad, dismounted from their horses, opened up on the clogged road full of Union cavalry and charged down the mountain, forcing the Union to retreat down and out of Monterey Pass. As rain poured down in sheets and thunder and lightning shook the sky, the mud ran freely on the road, and the fog and darkness of night clouded the soldiers' vision. The Battle of Monterey Pass began. It is this part of the engagement that is some of the most chaotic and confusing fighting seen during the Civil War. With the worsening weather conditions and the darkness of night, the soldiers struggled to see their own men, let alone the enemy. Captain Emack's Confederate troopers, clothed in rubber ponchos to help them combat the torrential downpour, hid within the woods on either side of the road, waiting for the Union to advance once again. The Confederates hid behind trees and changed positions in the darkness to make their 20 or so band of men look like a lot more. After waiting patiently for almost an hour, Yankee troopers began to move forward into the pass as horse hooves clanged against the rocks washed clean by water that washed away the mud that made up the road. Once the Union cavalry was within 12 paces of the Confederate bandito, they opened fire. The Confederate cannon again roared, sending shot into the darkness, producing very little damage to the Union soldiers, but it frightened them. Private Andrew D. Jackson of Company G of the 6th Michigan Cavalry wrote, "We could hear the shoes of our horses rattle against rocks and stones in the rush and dash of a little but now swollen mountain torrent as it sped along at our left. Time passed on, and the rain still came. We were getting nearer and nearer the summit. Pop, pop, in quick succession up in our front. I look up, and for the first time in hours, I could see something. It's the flash of a cannon, followed immediately by another, and swish, whiz, burr, over our heads, through the trees, and down the mountains goes half a cartload of iron in some form, but whether it was shot, shell, grape and canister, shrapnel, or the remnants of an old blacksmith shop, I could not tell by the sound." Unsure of the Confederate strength in the pass, Kilpatrick's Union troopers approached very slow and fired constantly, even when they were almost a mile away from the Confederate defenders. As the Union advanced, the small band of Confederates were running out of ammunition and was forced to move up the mountain as the severely larger Union force moved up Monterey Pass. With promise of reinforcements, these Confederates continued to fight, but General Grumble Jones had no reinforcements to provide, so he ordered his staff officers forward to lend aid to Emack's water-soaked troopers and ordered them all to conserve their ammunition. Meanwhile, the wagon train was only half over the mountain, as the teamsters also fought the muddy roads in the terrible weather. Both Jones and Emack urged for the wagon train to move faster, as the Union's breakthrough was imminent. As the Confederate soldiers sat in the dark, conserving their ammunition, the Union slowly advanced up the hazardous path. Everything was rather quiet until one Union trooper stepped on one of the Confederate troopers laying prone in the mud and the rain. When the Yankee froze in his tracks, the Confederate raised his pistol and he pulled the trigger and he killed the Union trooper. With that shot ringing out in the dark, the exhausted and scared Union troops fell back yet again against a hidden force that was a fraction of their size. After a part of Jones's Confederate cavalry attacked Kilpatrick's rear, Kilpatrick sought the help of a local boy to give him more intel of the lay of the land before him. With this information, Kilpatrick pressed 2 regiments to attack forward with more aggression. This thrust finally dislodged Captain Emack's men, who had now resorted to using rocks as weapons, and pushed them down the west side of the mountain, along with the lone Confederate cannon that fired all 5 of its shots. Kilpatrick's Union cavalry finally took the summit of the mountain around midnight and reached the location of the Monterey Inn, which is just behind me here. Though they could not see the wagon train that was still passing through the mountains, they could hear it, and they were close. Once the Federals captured the summit, Captain Emack's little band of Confederates were pushed down the west side of the mountain nearly a half a mile, and fighting occurred here in these woods where I'm at. And this is actually the battlefield site located here at Monterey, and they did a beautiful job. They have all kinds of walking trails here. Come visit if you would like. Now, Captain Kilpatrick claimed the high ground by making the Monterey Inn his headquarters and had 2 cannons of the 2nd U.S. Artillery placed on the summit. Anticipating a coming Union charge onto the Confederate line that was beginning to form on the western slopes, Kilpatrick ordered the cannons to fire shells above the enemy's head so it would not hit advancing Union troopers. To meet the Union troops in that dark, rainy, stormy environment, cavalry stretched up and down the wagon train was ordered to the front of the line to support Emack's forces holding back hundreds of Union troops. With the narrow, muddy, mountainous roads clogged with horses and wagons, it was difficult for the Confederate troopers to navigate in the dark and the rain, but they gathered in line the best they could to meet the Union and slowly advanced on the 2 cannons to allow their march south to continue and to save that wagon train. Now, Custer's men on the Union side were skirmishing with this Confederate line as the cannons fired, the lightning flashed, the thunder cracked, and bullets flew. Now, one trooper remembered the booming of the guns that hour of night with the roar of the thunder was terrifying indeed and beyond description. We would wait for a lightning flash and advance a few steps and then halt, and then for a light from the batteries and again advance. When an order went out for Custer's Michiganders to charge with sabers, the soaking wet men, blinded by pitch black darkness, didn't understand how to make the charge. The 5th Michigan's bugler recalled, "Charge? Charge what? And at this midnight hour?" While preparing the charge, a large thunder was heard once again in the darkness as fire flew from the lonely Confederate cannon after its ammo was finally replenished. Placed down the west slope of the mountain, the Confederate gunners could not angle the gun down far enough to target the forming Union line, so the shells were flying over the Yankees' heads, scaring the hell out of them as they dropped to the muddy ground with fear. As the two forces skirmished with each other in the dark, Captain James H. Kidd of the 6th Michigan observed the fighting. Kidd recalled, "We were deployed as skirmishers through a thick wood, so dark that we could see nothing, seeing the Rebs only by the flash of their guns. This was a night never to be forgotten. Had it not been for the noise and flashing of the enemy's fire, we should have wandered away in the darkness and been lost." After hours of Custer's Michigan Brigade struggling in the woods in a torrential storm, General Kilpatrick from his headquarters at the Monterey Inn called up fresh troops in the form of Major Charles E. Capehart and his 1st West Virginia Cavalry. The U.S. loyal West Virginians began their travel up the Monterey Pass around 3 a.m. Capehart was given orders to support Custer's men that was still engaged with the Confederates a mile from the inn along what is called Red Run, which they were engaged there for several hours. It was the arrival of Capehart and 640 men that finally broke Emack's little skirmishing band. Screaming like wild Indians, as one trooper recalled, Capehart's men dashed down the mountain, finally overtaking the lone Confederate cannon, rolling it down an embankment. The 2 Federal cannons bellowed out fire and shot, striking wagons of wounded and supplies as men wounded at Gettysburg who were still able to walk dashed into the darkened woods for safety. Emack and his Confederate defenders were forced in among the wagons as hundreds of Yankee cavalrymen descended upon them, firing at them and eventually entering hand-to-hand combat with sabers and revolvers flying and firing. In the darkened chaos of the forest, teamsters quickly moved to save their wagons, but with the congestion of the road full of horse, men, and wagon alike, many lost control or balance trying to pass damaged vehicles, and they tumbled into the ravines. Federal cavalrymen dashed in among broken wagons, taking many teamsters prisoner. This initial charge earned Major Charles E. Capehart the Medal of Honor here on the mountain. Captain Emack's men, reinforced by a few others, made a line at the western base of the mountain, which blunted the Federal charge. However, they were no match for the tidal wave of mud-covered Yankee troopers that were descending the mountain. General Grumble Jones, despite reports of his capture in Yankee papers, was able to escape across fields to arrive at Williamsport, where the main Confederate force was massing. As the dim light of the sun began to slightly peak on the opposite side of the mountain, the Union soldiers claimed their spoils. They seized the part of the wagon train that spanned from the foot of the mountain to the top of the mountain, capturing around 1,300 prisoners, and claimed the booty inside those wagons. Inside the wagons was not only military supplies, but supplies plundered from the Pennsylvania countryside, such as barrels of molasses, flour, smoked hams, cornmeal, clothing such as women's petticoats and women's and children's shoes, along with sugar, salt, bacon, and fine Confederate uniforms with gold watches and jewelry. Many horses and mules were seized, and many of the wagons were later destroyed. In the confusion of darkness, many confused their own as enemies, and many confused their enemies as their own. There were several incidents where Federal troops found themselves firing at their own men, thinking them Confederate, wounding and killing some of their own in friendly fire. After the capture of the wagon train at the foot of the mountain, Union cavalry built up a barricade of downed trees and broken wagon pieces to prepare for a Confederate counterattack. In the darkness rode up a cavalry unit in which a Union officer in charge raised his pistol and shouted, "Who comes there?" The answer from the darkness was a Southern voice saying, "10th Virginia Cavalry." And the Union officer responded, "To hell with you, 10th Virginia Cavalry," in which a volley was fired into the rebel horsemen. Also, 2 Confederate captains rode up to Kilpatrick's reserve command, asking the identity of the regiment. When a Union lieutenant raised his pistol and advised them to surrender, the 2 captains obliged. As the Union officers returned to Kilpatrick's headquarters here at the Monterey Inn on top of the mountain, they were greeted by the cheery sight of a warm, blazing bonfire to warm the wet and tired bodies of the soldiers and to light the night to help process the prisoners that were taken that morning. Writing about the fighting here at Monterey, newspaperman Paul wrote, "The road is more like the bed of a rock river. The dirt, having been washed away by the heavy rains, left large boulders exposed. Where there were no boulders, there was mud and water. Over the road the troopers dashed and splashed in the midnight darkness, yelling like demons. Is it to be wondered at that the Confederate soldiers unanimously declare that they will never visit Pennsylvania again?" Kilpatrick's cavalry, after fighting all night, continued their pursuit of the rebels. Captain James Kidd recalled, "As far as the eyes could reach, both front and rear, was a moving mass of horses, with motionless riders all wrapped in slumber. The horses were moving along with drooping heads and eyes half closed." Kilpatrick called for a halt here at Ringgold, Maryland, which was welcomed by all of his exhausted troopers. Just minutes after the halt was called, many fell asleep where they stood, in uniforms soaked in water and caked in mud. General Custer himself laid down in the soft mud under an eave of a church roof, possibly the meeting house that stands here today that's behind me here. And immediately, Custer fell asleep. Around him, his men also went to sleep, as the New York Times correspondent wrote, "Under the friendly protection of the dripping eaves of a chapel, a gay and gallant brigadier could have been seen enjoying in the mud one of those sound sleeps only obtained through fatigue, his long golden locks matted with the soil of Pennsylvania." However, this rest was finite, as 2 hours later, the provost guard notified the sleeping cavalry that it was time to move and to chase the escaping rebels. Reluctantly, they got up from their slumber, covered in mud, drenched from head to toe, and they mounted their exhausted steeds and headed off to battle once again. The Battle of Monterey Pass was a decisive victory for the Union, with Kilpatrick's own casualties being only 5 men killed, 10 wounded, and 28 missing, for a total of 43. Unique, as it was fought in darkness during a thunderstorm on rugged terrain like this mountain, it would be remembered by both Union and Confederate soldiers alike all their lives. Unfortunately for the Union, this engagement only made a small dent in the Confederate force that was escaping the fields of Gettysburg, as they would mass hundreds of wagons and booty taken from the north in and around Williamsport, Maryland, to prepare to cross the mighty Potomac River to Virginia. This included cattle and food stolen from the north that helped to feed the Army of Northern Virginia for the next year. With the thunderstorms and heavy rains that fell on July 3rd, 4th, and 5th of 1863, the Potomac River swelled in size, making it impossible to cross. Lee's army was backed against a natural barrier, with no means of escaping to his native lands of Virginia. As Confederate engineers constructed pontoon bridges and healthy soldiers dared to cross the dangerous waters of the river by swimming, Lee ordered trenches to be dug and defenses to be made in preparation of the Union advance onto their position. A Union advance that never came. General Meade of the Union Army of the Potomac lost a considerable number of men at Gettysburg, as well along with hundreds, if not thousands, of horses that restricted the mobility of his army. Despite calls to finish off Lee's army for good as they're backed up against the swollen Potomac River, Meade felt unable to push an attack on Lee and crush the Army of Northern Virginia. Despite their utter defeat at Gettysburg and the loss of the wagon train here at Monterey, the Confederates were able to sneak back across the Potomac River with stolen goods and livestock from the north, war supplies, their wounded, and wagons to live to fight yet another day. Thank you for watching. If you wish to see more, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Please see my sources in the description below also, and please, if you ever get a chance, come out here and explore the trails at the Battle of Monterey Pass battlefield. It is very nice up here. It's actually really cool. The only problem right now, because we had a lot of rain, is the bugs. But I've been swatting mosquitoes, but that's okay because it's still a wonderful trail, and once it dries out, the bugs will be gone. But thank you again, and remember that these stories are ours, and it is our duty to keep these stories alive. I'll see you next time as I explore What in the History.